In the year 1656, a young man of only 23 years was considered the greatest threat that organized religion had ever faced. He did not command armies, did not possess wealth, and held no position of power. He was merely a lens polisher who lived modestly and spent his nights writing by candlelight. His name was Baruch Spinoza, and what he discovered was so devastating that, nearly 400 years later, it still makes the Vatican tremble. Spinoza did something that no one before him had dared to do with such precision. He took the sacred texts that billions of people considered the literal word of God and analyzed them like any other historical document. He checked dates, compared versions, identified contradictions, and traced interpolations. And what he found was a web of manipulations so extensive and deliberate that it exposed not only human errors, but a conscious strategy of control. The books that Moses supposedly wrote contained descriptions of his own death and events that would only occur centuries later. The prophecies that were said to predict the future had clearly been written after the events they pretended to announce. Entire passages had been inserted, removed, or altered to justify political decisions made by priests and kings. The conclusion was inevitable. The Bible was not a divine document, but a human construction elaborated over centuries by men with very specific interests, and if the foundation was false, the entire edifice built upon it was also. The ecclesiastical hierarchies, the unquestionable dogmas, the mandatory rituals, the tithes collected in God's name, the holy wars fought over territories presented as divine missions, the tortures and executions of heretics who dared to disagree, all of this rested on texts that Spinoza demonstrated had been fabricated and manipulated by very human hands. The Vatican immediately understood the magnitude of the threat. This was not just another delusional heretic who could be easily discredited. Spinoza was a genius, and his arguments were constructed with impeccable logical rigor. Each assertion was accompanied by textual evidence. Each conclusion naturally followed from the premises. Refuting him would require confronting his analyses on the grounds of reason, and that was precisely what the Church could not do, because it knew it would lose. So they chose the path they always take when the truth threatens them. They tried to destroy the messenger. Spinoza was excommunicated with the most terrible words that religious tradition knew. He was cursed in every possible way, banished from his community, turned into a pariah. There were assassination attempts. He survived a stabbing that tore his coat and kept the peace as proof of what his enemies were capable of. His works were banned, burned, included in the Vatican's blacklist. For centuries, possessing his books was a crime punishable by imprisonment or death. But the truth has a peculiar characteristic. It does not die. It can be pursued, hidden, burned in public squares, but it always finds a way. Copies of Spinoza's writings were secretly preserved, passed from hand to hand by those who recognized their value, clandestinely translated, studied by brave minds who preferred the risk of truth to the comfort of illusion. And over time, his ideas were confirmed by archaeology, textual analysis, and the comparative history of religions. What Spinoza discovered alone, with the limited resources of the 17th century, turned out to be just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Today we know that the manipulations in biblical texts are even more extensive than he suspected. We know that ecclesiastical councils voted on which gospels would be considered sacred and which would be destroyed. We know that Roman emperors directly interfered in the formulation of dogmas to meet political conveniences. We know that translations were deliberately distorted to support doctrines that did not exist in the originals. We know that the Vatican still maintains over 80 kilometers of archives to which practically no one has access, documents that could rewrite the history of Christianity if they were made public. The question that Spinoza raised nearly 4 centuries ago remains unanswered. If the institution that presents itself as the guardian of divine truth needs to hide so many documents, manipulate so many texts, persecute so many thinkers, and keep so many secrets, then what exactly is it protecting? Certainly not the truth, because the truth does not fear the light. What hides in the shadows is always the lie, and the greater the effort to conceal it, the greater the lie must be. This story that you are about to follow is the complete reconstruction of Spinoza's work, updated with everything we have discovered since then. It is the systematic exposition of how a religious institution built its power on fraudulent foundations and continues to this day, employing the same strategies of control it used in the Middle Ages, only with more sophisticated methods. It is an invitation to look beyond appearances, to question what you have always been told is unquestionable, and to discover for yourself what happens when reason is applied to the domains that faith reserved for itself. Spinoza paid a very high price for these discoveries. He lived the rest of his life in isolation, working as a craftsman during the day and writing philosophy at night. Always watched, always threatened. He died at the age of 44, probably with his health ruined by the glass dust he inhaled in his work as a lens polisher, although some historians suspect less natural causes. But he died in peace, knowing that he had fulfilled his mission. He had ignited a flame that no one else would be able to extinguish. That flame is now before you. What you do with it depends entirely on your courage. Spinoza can no longer speak, but his words remain alive, waiting for minds willing to receive them. The Vatican continues to try to keep them forgotten, but it fails with each new generation that discovers the truth. And you, at this very moment, are joining this lineage of seekers who prefer the uncomfortable reality to the comforting fantasy. In the upcoming sections, we will walk together through each of Spinoza's discoveries. We will examine the evidence, analyze the texts, understand the mechanisms of manipulation. We will understand why the Vatican lied from the beginning and why it continues to lie to this day. And we will discover what it means to live on the other side of this revelation, when illusions fall away and only the naked truth remains, which, as Spinoza discovered, is more beautiful and liberating than any promised paradise. For over 2,000 years, a statement has been repeated as an absolute truth in synagogues, churches, and mosques around the world. The first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch or Torah, were written by Moses under direct inspiration from God. This was the cornerstone upon which the entire edifice of Abrahamic religions was built. If Moses received the law directly from God on Mount Sinai and faithfully recorded it in the sacred texts, then questioning these texts was equivalent to questioning God himself. This was the first and most important lie that Spinoza unmasked, and the arguments he presented are so devastating that they have not been refuted to this day. Spinoza began by making an apparently simple observation, but one with explosive consequences. The book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book attributed to Moses, contains a detailed description of the death and burial of Moses himself. The text describes how he went up to Mount Nebo, contemplated the promised land that he would never set foot in, died there, and was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, in a location that no one knows to this day. Furthermore, the text adds that no prophet like Moses ever arose in Israel, whom the Lord knew face to face. How could Moses have written about his own death? How could he have claimed that no prophet like him ever arose, when this could only be assessed long after his death? The obvious answer was that he did not write. Someone else wrote it long after, and attributed the text to Moses to confer authority upon it. But Spinoza did not stop at this initial observation. He delved into the texts with the precision of a detective, and found dozens of other pieces of evidence pointing in the same direction. The book of Genesis, for example, when describing Abraham's journey, mentions that the Canaanites were then in the land. The expression "were then" clearly indicates that, at the time of writing, the Canaanites were no longer there, which only happened centuries after Moses, when the Israelites conquered Canaan. Similarly, the text mentions the city of Dan, but we know from other biblical passages that this city only received that name during the time of the judges, long after Moses' death. How could Moses use a name that the city did not yet have in his time? Spinoza also identified revealing historical anachronisms. The text of Genesis mentions that Abraham pursued his enemies to Dan, but the region was only called that after the conquest by the tribe of Dan, an event recorded in the book of Judges as having occurred long after the Exodus from Egypt. The book of Numbers, talking about the books of the wars of the Lord, as if they were already known and established documents, when in fact such records could only have been compiled after the conquest wars of Canaan. In Deuteronomy, there are references to kings of Israel at a time when Israel still had no kings. The monarchy would only be established centuries later, with Saul and David. Linguistic analysis revealed even more problems. The texts of the Pentateuch exhibit variations in style, vocabulary, and theological perspective that are impossible to reconcile with a single author. Some passages refer to God as Yahweh, others as Elohim, and these variations are not random. They group into coherent blocks that seem to have come from different sources, later combined. Some sections present a view of God as an anthropomorphic figure who walks in the Garden of Eden and speaks directly with humans. Others describe him as a transcendent entity that manifests only through angels or visions. Some passages demonstrate priestly concerns with rituals and sacrifices. Others emphasize ethical and prophetic issues. The diversity is too great for a single author, especially one who was supposedly recording consistent divine revelations. Spinoza then proposed a hypothesis that would be confirmed by centuries of subsequent research. The Pentateuch was compiled long after the time of Moses, probably by Ezra, the scribe who led the return of the Jews from Babylonian exile in the 5th century before Christ. Ezra would have gathered oral traditions, fragmentary documents, and texts from different origins, editing them into a unique narrative that he then attributed to Moses to confer the necessary authority. The goal was not to preserve historical truth, but to create a founding text that would unify the Jewish people around a common identity after the trauma of exile. The implications of this discovery were devastating for established religions. If Moses did not write the Torah, then the claim that these texts represent the literal word of God dictated to his prophet was false. If the texts were composed and edited by scribes over centuries, then they reflected not divine will, but the interests, prejudices, and limitations of their human authors. If passages were added, removed, or modified at different times, then there was no way to know what was original and what was later interpolation. The unquestionable authority of the sacred texts crumbled, and with it, the authority of the institutions that presented themselves as their guardians and interpreters. The Vatican understood the danger perfectly. Although the Catholic Church based its authority primarily on the New Testament, the connection with the Old Testament was fundamental to its narrative. Jesus was presented as the fulfillment of messianic prophecies, the new Moses who brought a new law. If the texts attributed to Moses were fraudulent, the entire theological edifice was compromised. Moreover, the same methods of critical analysis that Spinoza applied to the Old Testament could be applied to the New, and the results would be equally devastating, as we will see in the following blocks. The reaction was immediate and violent. Spinoza's arguments were declared heretical, blasphemous, inspired by the devil. No one bothered to refute them point by point, because that would require admitting that the points deserved consideration. Instead, the strategy was to disqualify the messenger, ban his works, threaten anyone who read them. For 2 centuries, this strategy worked reasonably well, at least on the surface. But in universities, in academic circles, among scholars who had access to the forbidden texts, the seed planted by Spinoza was silently germinating. In the 19th century, German scholars developed what became known as the documentary hypothesis, a theory that confirmed and expanded Spinoza's intuitions. Through meticulous analysis, they identified at least 4 distinct sources that were combined to form the Pentateuch: the Yahwist source, which used the name Yahweh for God; the Elohist source, which preferred the name Elohim; the Deuteronomist source, primarily responsible for the Book of Deuteronomy; and the priestly source focused on rituals and genealogies. Each source had its own characteristics, distinct vocabulary, and specific theological concerns. The combination of these sources explained the contradictions, repetitions, and inconsistencies that any attentive reader could perceive in the texts. Archaeological discoveries of the 20th century brought even more confirmations. Texts found in Ugarit in present-day Lebanon revealed that many biblical stories had parallels in older Canaanite mythologies. The account of the flood, for example, was remarkably similar to the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian text predating the Bible by at least 1,000 years. The laws of the Code of Hammurabi, also predating Moses, contained surprisingly similar provisions to the Mosaic laws. The conclusion was inevitable. The biblical authors were not recording unique divine revelations, but adapting and reworking traditions that circulated throughout the ancient Near East. Today, the dominant academic position is that Spinoza was essentially correct. No serious biblical criticism scholar defends the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch anymore. The texts are recognized as late compilations of diverse traditions, edited and re-edited over centuries to serve specific political and religious purposes. But this information, widely available in any university, rarely reaches the faithful in churches. Sermons continue to assert that Moses wrote the Torah. Catechisms continue to teach that the texts are the Word of God. The lie that Spinoza exposed nearly 4 centuries ago continues to be repeated every Sunday in millions of temples around the world. Spinoza did not settle for demonstrating that the sacred texts had human authorship. He went further and attacked the very concept of miracle, the most powerful tool that religions use to claim divine authority. If God intervenes in the world through supernatural events that suspend the laws of nature, then those who witness or record these events have access to a source of knowledge superior to common reason. The priests, as guardians of miraculous accounts, become indispensable intermediaries between humans and the divine. Spinoza understood that demolishing the concept of miracle meant demolishing the foundation of ecclesiastical power, and he dedicated some of his brightest pages to this task. Spinoza's argument was elegant in its simplicity. God, he argued, is not an entity separate from nature that occasionally decides to intervene in it. God is nature itself in its entirety, the eternal and unchanging order that governs all things. The laws of nature are not arbitrary decrees that God can suspend when it suits him. They are necessary expressions of the divine essence. To say that God violates the laws of nature to perform a miracle is to say that God violates himself, which is a logical contradiction. Therefore, miracles understood as suspensions of natural laws are impossible by definition. But then, how to explain the accounts of miracles in the sacred texts? Spinoza offered several complementary explanations. First, many events described as miraculous were simply natural phenomena that the ancients did not understand. The parting of the Red Sea, for example, could have been caused by strong winds and favorable tides. The falling of manna in the desert might refer to a natural secretion from certain insects or plants that the Israelites were unaware of. The plagues of Egypt could be explained by a chain of natural events triggered by specific climatic conditions. There was no need to invoke the supernatural when the natural, although unknown at the time, offered sufficient explanations. Second, Spinoza noted that the accounts of miracles followed suspiciously convenient patterns. They always occurred at moments when they were most needed for the narrative, when the people needed convincing, when enemies needed to be defeated, when a leader's authority needed to be confirmed. This convenience suggested not real events, but literary constructions designed to produce specific effects on readers. The miracles were rhetorical tools, not historical records. Third, Spinoza observed that different religious traditions reported equally impressive miracles, often mutually exclusive. If Christian miracles proved the truth of Christianity, then the miracles reported in Hindu, Buddhist, or Muslim texts must equally prove the truth of those religions. But since all could not be true simultaneously, miracles could not serve as a criterion of truth. The fact that each tradition accepted only its own miracles and rejected those of others revealed that belief in miracles depended not on evidence, but on prior affiliation. People believed in the miracles of their religion because they already believed in their religion, not the other way around. And here is something important for you who are watching. Notice how this logic perfectly applies to what happens even today. Millions of Catholics believe in the miracles of Fatima, but reject the Marian apparitions reported by other denominations. Evangelicals accept miraculous healings in their churches, but consider the healings in Umbanda tereros as frauds. Muslims revere the miracles attributed to Muhammad, but deny the miracles of Jesus as the Son of God. Each group applies rigorous skepticism to the claims of others and total credulity to their own. Spinoza saw this nearly 400 years ago, and nothing has changed since then. If you are recognizing this pattern, if something is clicking in your mind right now, know that you are not alone. Alone. Thousands of people around the world are going through the same awakening process that you are experiencing right now. Leave in the comments the moment you began to question, the moment you realized that something didn't make sense in the story that you were always told. And if you want to continue on this journey of discovery, subscribe to the channel now, because what comes in the next blocks will delve even deeper into these revelations. Returning to Spinoza. His analysis of miracles revealed something even more disturbing when applied specifically to biblical texts. He demonstrated that many miracles in the Old Testament were adapted versions of stories that circulated throughout the ancient Middle East. The account of Moses' birth, placed in a basket in the river and found by a princess, was practically identical to the legend of the birth of Sargon of Akkad, a Mesopotamian king who lived over 1,000 years earlier. The story of Samson, the hero whose strength resided in his hair, had obvious parallels with the Greek myth of Hercules. The account of Elijah ascending to heaven in a chariot of fire echoed divine ascensions found in multiple pagan traditions. This did not necessarily mean that the biblical authors had consciously copied from other sources, although in some cases this was likely. It meant that there was a common repertoire of mythical motifs that different cultures used to express their beliefs. The miracles were not unique events that proved the superiority of one religion over others. They were recurring narrative elements that all religions employed to add drama to their stories. The originality that the biblical texts claimed was illusory. They participated in the same mythological tradition as their pagan neighbors, just with modified names and details. When Spinoza turned his attention to the miracles of the New Testament, the conclusions were even more politically delicate, but equally devastating intellectually. The virgin birth of Jesus, for example, was not a unique claim in the ancient world. Hercules was born of Zeus with a mortal woman, Perseus too. Romulus and Remus, founders of Rome, were sons of Mars with a Vestal virgin. Dionysus was born of Zeus with Semele. The pattern was clear. Divine or semi-divine heroes were born from unions between gods and human women, often virgins. The early Christians, living in an environment saturated with these narratives, naturally applied the same pattern to Jesus to elevate his divine status. The resurrection, the central miracle of Christianity, also had abundant precedents. Osiris in Egypt died and resurrected annually. Attis in Phrygia went through the same cycle. Adonis in Phoenicia died and came back to life. Dionysus was torn apart and reconstituted. The idea of a god who dies and is reborn was deeply rooted in the mystery religions of the ancient Mediterranean, long before Christianity emerged. This did not prove that the resurrection of Jesus did not happen, but it demonstrated that the claim was not as singular as Christians asserted. It was part of a widely disseminated mythological pattern. Spinoza was careful in how he presented these analyses, aware that he was treading on explosive ground. But his conclusion was unequivocal. Miracles could not serve as a foundation for faith, because their verification was impossible, and their interpretation always depended on prior assumptions. A person who already believed would accept any evidence in favor of miracles and reject any evidence against. A person who did not believe would do the opposite. Miracles did not convince anyone who was not already convinced. They merely reinforced pre-existing beliefs. The Vatican, evidently, could not accept this analysis. Miracles were and continue to be fundamental to the Church's economy. Saints are canonized based on attested miracles. Shrines attract millions of pilgrims seeking miraculous cures. The papacy itself claims authority based on a succession that traces back to Peter, whose special position was established by miraculous events. Demolishing the concept of miracle was to demolish the foundations of the building. The Church's response was, again, not to confront the arguments, but to suppress the arguer. Spinoza's books were banned. His followers were persecuted. Priests and theologians were expressly ordered not to mention his ideas, not even to refute them, as the mere mention could awaken curiosity among the faithful. The strategy was forced forgetfulness, the hope that if no one spoke of Spinoza, his ideas would die with him. But the strategy failed. 2 centuries after Spinoza, New Testament scholars began to apply the same methods of critical analysis to the Gospels that he had applied to the Old Testament. And they discovered exactly what he had predicted. The accounts of miracles in the Gospels showed clear signs of progressive literary elaboration. The Gospel of Mark, the oldest, had fewer miracles and more sober descriptions. Matthew and Luke, written later, added miracles and amplified the existing ones. John, the last, presented the most spectacular miracles and the highest theological claims. The pattern was one of legendary growth, not historical record. Today, the predominant academic position is that the miracles in the biblical texts should be understood as expressions of faith from the communities that produced them, not as records of verifiable historical events. This position is accepted even by many Catholic and Protestant theologians working in universities. But again, this information rarely reaches the faithful. From the pulpits, miracles continue to be presented as proof of divine intervention. In Sunday schools, children continue to learn that Jesus walked on water and literally multiplied loaves. The lie that Spinoza exposed continues to be perpetuated, generation after generation. If miracles were the demonstration of divine power in the present, prophecies were the demonstration of his knowledge of the future. A God who can foresee events before they happen clearly possesses knowledge superior to human, and those who record his predictions deserve to be heard with special reverence. Fulfilled prophecies were presented as irrefutable proof of the divine inspiration of the biblical texts. After all, how could human authors know the future unless God revealed it to them? Spinoza devoted a substantial part of his analysis to demolishing this claim, revealing that biblical prophecies were either too vague to mean anything specific or had clearly been written after the events they supposedly predicted. The first type of prophecy, the vague ones, was easy to identify. Statements like, "There will be wars and rumors of wars," or "Nation will rise against nation," were not predictions. They were obvious truths. At any point in human history, in any region of the world, there have always been wars and rumors of wars. Predicting that they would continue to exist required no supernatural knowledge. Similarly, prophecies about natural disasters, famines, and plagues were safe bets, as such events occurred regularly throughout all ages. The biblical prophets were not predicting the future. They were describing the human condition in such generic terms that they always seemed relevant. The second type, the seemingly specific prophecies that were fulfilled, proved even more problematic when examined closely. Spinoza demonstrated that, in many cases, the prophecies had been written or edited after the events they supposedly predicted. The book of Daniel, for example, contained detailed predictions about the succession of empires from Babylon to the Greek period, including references that only made sense as descriptions of the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who lived in the 2nd century before Christ. The accuracy was impressive for events up to that time, but from there the predictions became vague and imprecise. The simplest explanation was that the book was written during Antiochus's reign, not centuries earlier as claimed. The author knew the past because he was describing it disguised as prediction, but did not know the future because he was human like anyone else. This technique, known to scholars as prophecy ex eventu, or prophecy after the event, was common in the ancient world. Texts were attributed to revered figures of the past to confer authority upon them, and authors included predictions of already known events to create the illusion of prescience. Once the credibility of the prophet was established through these retrospective predictions, readers more easily accepted the genuinely predictive parts of the text, even when these failed to materialize. Spinoza applied this analysis to the messianic prophecies that Christianity claimed had been fulfilled in Jesus. The result was devastating for Christian theology. He demonstrated that many of the passages cited as prophecies about Jesus had been taken out of their original context and reinterpreted in ways that the original authors never intended. The famous verse from Isaiah about a virgin who would conceive and bear a son, for example, clearly referred in its original context to contemporary events of the prophet, not to something that would happen 700 years later. The Hebrew word used simply meant young woman, not necessarily virgin, and the Greek translation that Christians used had introduced this specific connotation. The process by which the authors of the New Testament found prophecies in the Old Testament also revealed more about their own beliefs than about any divine plan. Matthew, in particular, was famous for finding fulfilled prophecies in the most unlikely places. He quoted Hosea saying, "Out of Egypt I called my son," as a prophecy of the flight of Jesus to Egypt, ignoring that the original text clearly spoke of the people of Israel, not of an individual. It cited Jeremiah about Rachel weeping for her children as a prophecy of the massacre of the innocents by Herod, although the original text referred to the Babylonian exile. The pattern suggested that Matthew was searching the ancient texts for any passage that could be connected, even if remotely, to the events of Jesus' life, freely reinterpreting them to create the impression of prophetic fulfillment. Spinoza asked, if the prophecies were so clear and specific, why did the Jews contemporary to Jesus not recognize them? Why did the vast majority of the people who knew the Hebrew Scriptures by heart, who studied the prophets from childhood, who eagerly awaited the promised Messiah, reject Jesus as an impostor? The obvious answer was that the prophecies were neither clear nor specific when read in their original context. They only seemed to apply to Jesus when read retrospectively, already with the desired conclusion in mind. Christians found what they were looking for because they searched with the answer already decided. This did not mean that the authors of the New Testament were necessarily dishonest. They likely genuinely believed that Jesus was the promised Messiah and interpreted the Scriptures through that lens of faith. But their sincerity did not make their interpretations correct. Sincere people can be sincerely wrong, especially when they are emotionally invested in a particular outcome. The desire for the prophecies to be fulfilled was the father of the interpretation that saw fulfillment where there objectively was none. Spinoza went further and observed a disturbing pattern. The gospel accounts of Jesus' life seemed, at various points, to have been shaped to fit the prophecies rather than the other way around. The birth in Bethlehem, for example, was necessary to fulfill the prophecy of Micah, but created contradictions with other information that indicated Nazareth as Jesus' origin. The triumphal entry into Jerusalem riding on a donkey was strangely specific for a spontaneous event, unless it had been deliberately staged to evoke the passage from Zechariah. Jesus' cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" were the opening words of Psalm 22, the same psalm that spoke of pierced hands and feet and of executioners dividing garments, details that appear in the accounts of the crucifixion. The possibility that Spinoza raised was disturbing. What if the authors of the Gospels were not recording historical memories, but constructing theological narratives using the prophecies as a script? In that case, the fulfillment of the prophecies would not be evidence of divine foreknowledge, but of human literary skill. The Gospels would not prove that Jesus was the predicted Messiah, only that his followers knew the Hebrew Scriptures well enough to write a story that fit the expectations. Later scholars extensively developed this line of inquiry. Albert Schweitzer in the early 20th century showed how each generation created a Jesus in its own image, projecting onto the texts what it wished to find. Rudolf Bultmann applied form criticism methods and demonstrated how the gospel accounts were shaped by the needs of the communities that transmitted them. Today, most scholars recognize that the Gospels are theological documents, not biographies in the modern sense, and that separating the historical Jesus from the Christ of faith is an extremely difficult, perhaps impossible task. The Vatican once again chose to suppress rather than confront. The list of prohibited books grew to include virtually all of modern biblical criticism. Priests were trained in isolated seminaries where these ideas never penetrated. The faithful were warned against reading texts not approved by the Church. The message was clear: leave the interpretation of sacred texts to the authorized experts who know what you should believe. But the genie had escaped from the bottle. With the invention of the printing press, the spread of literacy, and the eventual weakening of the Church's temporal power, the works of Spinoza and his successors became increasingly accessible. Today, anyone with internet access can find detailed analyses of biblical prophecies and verify for themselves how the game worked. The lie that sustained empires for millennia is crumbling in slow motion, and more people are awakening. Spinoza's analyses of the authorship of the texts, the fabricated miracles, and the forged prophecies converged on an even more radical conclusion. The very God of traditional religions was a human invention, not a discovery, not a revelation, not an encounter with a transcendent reality, an invention in the most literal sense of the word. Humans created God in their own image, projecting onto the cosmos their own amplified qualities, desires, fears, and prejudices. And they did this not by accident or innocence, but because the idea of God was useful. It was the most powerful tool ever invented to control human beings. Spinoza observed that the God of the Bible had suspiciously human characteristics. He felt anger and jealousy. He favored some peoples and individuals at the expense of others. He changed his mind, repented, made agreements, and broke them. He ordered massacres, accepted sacrifices, demanded worship and praise. He behaved, in short, like an Eastern tyrant with supernatural powers, exactly as one would expect if the idea of God had been created by people who knew only Eastern tyrants as models of supreme power. This anthropomorphization of God was not an accidental defect of the texts. It was an essential characteristic for their function. An abstract, impersonal God who does not care about human affairs does not serve as an instrument of control. To motivate obedience, a God who observes, judges, rewards, and punishes is necessary. A God who is offended by disobedience and pleased by submission. A God who can be appeased through rituals administered by authorized priests. Each of these attributes increased the power of those who presented themselves as intermediaries between God and humans. Spinoza identified the fundamental psychological mechanism that made this construction so effective: the fear of death. Human beings are the only animals that know they will die. This awareness of one's own mortality is a source of profound existential anguish, and religions around the world have emerged to deal with it. The promise of an afterlife, of eternal reward for the righteous and punishment for the wicked, alleviates anguish and provides motivation for moral behavior, even when there is no human oversight. Believing that an omniscient God is always watching is to internalize a perpetual watcher, ensuring conformity far more effectively than any human police could. The problem, Spinoza observed, is that this arrangement places immense power in the hands of those who define what God wants. If you control the narrative about divine desires, you control the people who believe that narrative. You can say that God demands tithes and people will pay, that God condemns heretics and people will persecute them, that God favors a certain ruler and people will obey him, that God disapproves of a certain sexual behavior and people will feel guilt. Religion thus becomes an extraordinarily efficient system of social control, far more sophisticated than brute force because it operates within the very minds of the controlled. Spinoza was not saying that all religious leaders were cynical, conscious manipulators. Many certainly believed in what they preached, but that did not change the objective function of the system. A genuinely devout priest who sincerely believed he was conveying God's will was still exercising power over his faithful through mechanisms that did not withstand rational analysis. The sincerity of the manipulator does not absolve the manipulation. The alternative that Spinoza proposed was revolutionary in his time and remains challenging today. He argued that God, if the term should mean anything, should be identified with nature itself in its infinite totality, not a creator separate from his creation, but the very substance of everything that exists, not a person with wills and preferences, but the eternal and necessary order that governs all things, not a celestial king who demands worship and punishes disobedience, but the ultimate reality that can be known through reason and contemplated with what Spinoza called intellectual love. This God of Spinoza did not serve the purposes of institutional religion. He could not be appeased with sacrifices because he had no desires to satisfy. He did not favor chosen peoples because he made no choices. He did not respond to prayers because he did not intervene in events. He did not promise an afterlife because the eternity he offered was of another kind, the eternity of mathematical truth, of natural order, of knowledge that transcends the individual not through personal survival, but through participation in the infinite whole. It was a stark, demanding vision that did not offer the comforts of popular religion, but Spinoza argued that it was more dignified, more true, more liberating. To live in fear of a punitive God was degrading. To live in hope of celestial reward was childish. The wise understood the necessity of all things, including their own finitude, and found peace not in fleeing to comforting fantasies, but in the rational acceptance of reality as it is. The Vatican immediately realized that this philosophy was more dangerous than declared atheism. An atheist could be dismissed as lost, corrupted, influenced by the devil. But Spinoza spoke of God, used the word God, demonstrated reverence for something he called divine. His position was more subtle, more difficult to caricature, more appealing to sophisticated minds that did not simply want to abandon all spirituality, but could not accept the crudeness of popular religion either. Spinoza offered a middle path that threatened to drain thoughtful believers from established churches. Accusations of atheism rained down on Spinoza, but he calmly rejected them. He was not an atheist. On the contrary, his philosophy was saturated with God, only it was a radically different God from that of the theologians. To call him an atheist was to reveal more about the limitations of those who accused him than about his actual position. Those who could not conceive of God except as a celestial monarch with enlarged human characteristics were not defending divinity. They were revealing their own inability to think beyond anthropomorphic metaphors. Centuries later, Spinoza's position would find surprising echoes. Einstein declared that he believed in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the ordered harmony of existence, not in a God who cares about human destinies and actions. Contemporary physicists and cosmologists often express admiration for the mathematical order of the universe in terms that echo Spinoza. The tradition he inaugurated, a reverent naturalism that finds meaning in understanding nature without resorting to the supernatural, remains alive and influential among thinkers who are not satisfied with either traditional theism or arid materialism. But in churches, synagogues, and mosques, the anthropomorphic God that Spinoza criticized continues to reign. Sermons still speak of a God who rejoices, grieves, and becomes angry. Prayers still plead for miraculous interventions. Believers still tremble before the final judgment. The human invention that Spinoza exposed retains its power over billions of minds because the fear of death has not diminished and the need for comfort has not disappeared. The lie persists, not because it is true, but because it is useful, for those who administer it and for those who prefer the comforting illusion to the demanding truth. Spinoza understood that the theological lies he had identified did not exist in a vacuum. They served very concrete purposes of political and economic power. The church was not just a spiritual organization concerned with the salvation of souls. It was one of the greatest political powers in the world, with territories, armies, treasures, and networks of influence that rivaled the greatest empires. To understand why the lies were perpetuated with such tenacity, it was necessary to follow the trail of power and money. The history of the Church's rise to temporal power is one of the most extraordinary in human civilization. Starting as a small, marginal Jewish sect in a remote province of the Roman Empire, Christianity transformed in 3 centuries into the official religion of the greatest empire of antiquity. This transformation was not simply the result of spiritual truth conquering hearts. It was the result of a strategic alliance with political power that benefited both sides. Constantine, in the 4th century, realized that Christianity could provide a unifying ideology for a fragmented empire, while Christian leaders realized that imperial patronage could transform their persecuted faith into a dominant religion. The agreement was mutually beneficial. The emperor received divine legitimation for his rule, the bishops received protection, funding, and the elimination of their competitors. Pagan religions were progressively marginalized, their temples confiscated, their priests proscribed. Variants of Christianity deemed heretical were suppressed with the help of the state's armed arm. What emerged from this process was not the pure Christianity of the early followers of Jesus, but an imperial religion shaped to serve the needs of power. Spinoza observed how this alliance left deep marks on the very texts and dogmas. The Council of Nicaea, convened by Constantine in 325, was not an assembly of disinterested wise men seeking theological truth. It was a political conference where factions competed for imperial favor. The definition of the nature of Christ, which would be debated for centuries, had immediate practical implications. Those whose position prevailed would gain authority over those who lost. It is no coincidence that the position that eventually won was the one most convenient for the hierarchical structure of the institutional church. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the church not only survived, but expanded its power. While political structures crumbled, the ecclesiastical organization remained intact, with its communication networks, written records, and disciplined hierarchy. The bishops of Rome, in particular, seized the power vacuum to present themselves as successors not only of Peter, but in some way of the emperors themselves. The title of Pontifex Maximus, previously held by Roman emperors in their religious function, was assumed by the popes. The church was becoming the heir of Rome. During the Middle Ages, this power expanded enormously. The doctrine of the 2 swords asserted that God had conferred upon the Pope authority over spiritual matters and upon kings authority over temporal matters. But since the soul was superior to the body, spiritual authority was superior to temporal. In practice, this meant that popes could excommunicate kings, freeing their subjects from the duty of obedience. They could interdict entire kingdoms, prohibiting the celebration of sacraments, which in a society where eternal salvation was taken seriously, constituted a terrible weapon. They could call for crusades, mobilizing armies from all over Europe for causes they defined as sacred. The accumulated wealth was proportional to power. Tithes were collected from the entire Christian population. Indulgences were sold, promising reductions of penalties in purgatory. Lands were donated by believers, hoping to secure their salvation. Monasteries became important economic centers, with vast agricultural properties worked by peasants. The church was probably the largest landowner in medieval Europe, and its wealth was legendary, and often scandalous. Spinoza lived at a time when this power was beginning to be questioned. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the unity of Western Christendom a century before his birth. Protestant princes had discovered that rejecting papal authority allowed them to confiscate ecclesiastical properties and control religion in their own territories. The religious wars that devastated Europe demonstrated that Christian unity under Rome was irretrievable. But even weakened, the Catholic Church remained a formidable power, and in the regions it controlled, the persecution of dissenters continued relentlessly. What Spinoza clearly perceived was that the Church's power structure depended on the theological lies he had identified. If Moses did not write the Torah, the authority based on a Mosaic revelation was compromised. If miracles did not prove divine intervention, the claim of supernatural authority crumbled. If prophecies were fabricated, the claim that Jesus fulfilled a pre-announced divine plan lost strength. If God was a human construction, then those who spoke in God's name were speaking only in their own name. More importantly, if the sacred texts were human documents subject to critical analysis, then there was no reason for lay people to accept the clergy's interpretation as definitive. Every educated person could read, analyze, and conclude for themselves. The monopoly on truth that the Church claimed dissolved the moment the faithful realized that the texts were not as mysterious or as uniform as they had been told. That is why the Church fought so fiercely against any attempt to question the foundations. It was not just about defending abstract theological truths. It was about defending a power system that greatly benefited those at the top of the hierarchy. Cardinals lived in palaces. Popes sponsored artists and built monuments. The luxury of the Vatican contrasted obscenely with the poverty of the majority of the faithful, whose tithes financed it. Questioning theology was questioning the justification for all of this. Spinoza proposed a radical separation between religion and state that threatened this arrangement. If each person was free to believe or not believe according to their own conscience, if the state had no obligation to impose religious orthodoxy, if salvation was a private matter and not a public one, then the Church lost its main tool of power. It could no longer use the secular arm to persecute heretics. It could no longer interdict kingdoms or excommunicate rulers. It could no longer present itself as the necessary intermediary between God and men. Spinoza's vision would only become reality centuries later, with the liberal revolutions that separated church and state in much of the West. But even today, the struggle continues. In many countries, the Church maintains tax privileges and disproportionate political influence. The Vatican remains a sovereign state with worldwide diplomatic representation. Religious hierarchs pronounce themselves on public policies as if their opinion carried special weight. The separation that Spinoza advocated is far from complete, and the forces that benefit from the intertwining of religion and power constantly work to reverse it. There is a place in the heart of Rome where secrets are kept that could rewrite history. It is called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, until recently known as the Secret Archive, a name that was changed in 2019 precisely because it revealed too much about its nature. More than 80 kilometers of shelves contain documents dating back to the 8th century, correspondences of popes and emperors, minutes of councils, records of inquisitorial trials, reports from apostolic nuncios from around the world, treaties and bulls, confessions and condemnations. It is probably the largest collection of historical documents in the Western world, and access to it is strictly controlled. Spinoza never had access to these archives. Very few have. But he knew they existed, and he understood what their existence meant. An institution that presents itself as the guardian of divine truth, a truth that supposedly should be proclaimed to all peoples, keeps millions of documents locked away from the public eye. If these documents confirmed the official narrative, why not release them? The obvious answer is that they do not confirm, and likely contradict it in ways that would be devastating if widely known. Over the centuries, fragments have occasionally leaked, and each leak confirmed the worst suspicions. In the 19th century, when portions of the archives were briefly opened during the Napoleonic occupation, scholars discovered documents revealing ecclesiastical manipulations on an industrial scale. The famous Donation of Constantine, a document that supposedly recorded the granting of vast territories to the Pope by Emperor Constantine, was definitively proven to be a medieval forgery, although the Church had based territorial claims on it for centuries. How many other forgeries are still waiting to be exposed on dusty shelves? The records of the Inquisition are particularly sensitive. For centuries, the Church tortured and executed thousands of people for crimes such as heresy, witchcraft, and secret Judaism. The trials were meticulously recorded, including transcripts of interrogations under torture. These documents would reveal not only the cruelty of the system, but also its arbitrary nature, how accusations often arose from denunciations motivated by envy or revenge, how confessions were obtained through methods that would make anyone admit to anything, how the machinery of ecclesiastical terror operated routinely and bureaucratically. Some of these records have eventually been released, but in a selective and controlled manner. The case of Galileo was revisited in 1992, and the Church admitted that the scientist had been treated unjustly, nearly 400 years after the fact. The files related to the papacy of Pius IV during World War II were partially opened in 2020, but scholars report that crucial documents seem to be missing or have been reorganized in ways that hinder research. The pattern is consistent: minimal release, maximum control, always prioritizing the protection of institutional image over historical truth. The archives also contain records of how biblical texts were transmitted and edited over the centuries. We know that there were multiple versions of the Gospels in the early centuries of Christianity, many of them divergent on important points. We know that councils decided which texts would be included in the canon and which would be destroyed. We know that copies were made by scribes who occasionally altered the text, sometimes by mistake, sometimes deliberately to align it with preferred theological positions. The oldest manuscripts we possess of the New Testament date from centuries after the events they describe, and they differ from each other in thousands of points. The Vatican archives contain some of the oldest known manuscripts, including the famous Codex Vaticanus, but they also contain records of how these manuscripts were copied, edited, and used. They contain correspondences between theologians debating which version of a text should be considered authoritative. They contain decisions by popes and councils on how to resolve contradictions between manuscripts. All of this would reveal that the biblical text presented to the faithful today as the inerrant Word of God is the result of a long process of human editing, with choices made for reasons that often had more to do with ecclesiastical politics than with fidelity to any sacred original. Spinoza intuited all of this through his analysis of the available texts. He did not need the archives to realize that the Bible was a human compilation with a human history, but the archives would confirm his conclusions with irrefutable primary documentation, and that is precisely why they remain closed. In recent years, there has been increasing pressure for greater openness. Historians argue that documents centuries old can no longer cause legitimate harm to living individuals and should be released for study. Survivors of ecclesiastical abuses demand access to records that could reveal patterns of institutional cover-up. Governments question why the Vatican, an entity that presents itself as morally superior, maintains a level of secrecy that no modern democracy would consider acceptable. The Vatican's response has been a trickle of releases, always accompanied by carefully constructed narratives that minimize anything embarrassing. It is a damage control strategy, not a transparency one. And as long as millions of pages remain inaccessible, Spinoza's question will remain unanswered. What exactly are they hiding? The existence of these archives is, in itself, a confession. An institution that possesses the truth does not need to hide it. An institution that trusts its history does not need to control it. Only an institution that knows that the truth of its history would condemn it would maintain this level of secrecy for centuries. The Vatican, through its own behavior, confirms the suspicions that Spinoza raised. There is something in the foundations of the Church that does not withstand the light of day. Spinoza focused much of his analysis on the Old Testament, but the implications of his method for the New Testament were clear, and later scholars developed them extensively. What they discovered confirmed and deepened their suspicions. The Gospels were not impartial historical records of Jesus' life, but carefully constructed theological documents designed to serve the needs of specific communities at specific times. The first shocking fact for many Christians is the chronology. Jesus supposedly died around the year 30. The oldest Gospel we possess, Mark, was written approximately 40 years later, around the year 70. Matthew and Luke came later, likely in the 80s and 90s. John is even later, possibly from the early 2nd century. None of the authors knew Jesus personally. None were eyewitnesses of the events they narrated. They wrote based on oral traditions that had circulated for decades, being modified with each retelling. 40 years seems short in historical terms, but consider what it means for the transmission of information in a predominantly illiterate society. Imagine if today you tried to accurately reconstruct conversations and events from 1985 based solely on stories that people tell each other, without recordings, without written records, in communities spread across different countries speaking different languages. The potential for distortion is enormous, even assuming the best of intentions. And intentions were not always the best. The primitive Christian communities were diverse and often conflicting. There were groups that emphasized continuity with Judaism, and groups that wanted to break completely from it. There were groups that expected the imminent return of Jesus, and groups that prepared for a prolonged presence in the world. There were groups led by apostles who had known Jesus, and groups that emerged around later charismatic figures. Each group had an incentive to shape the story of Jesus in ways that validated their own positions. The Gospels that have come down to us represent the winners of these disputes. We know that there were dozens of other Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, of Peter, of Mary Magdalene, of Judas, and many others, that were declared heretical and systematically destroyed. The Gospel of Thomas, rediscovered in the 20th century, presents a very different Jesus from the canonical one, a master of wisdom who teaches through enigmatic sayings, without dramatic miracles or explicit claims of divinity. The Gnostic Gospels presented complex cosmologies in which the creator God of the Old Testament was actually an inferior or malevolent being. The decision about which Gospels would be considered canonical was not made in the early years of Christianity, but gradually over centuries. There was no moment when the 4 canonical Gospels were officially selected. The canon crystallized slowly through liturgical use and theological debate, with different regions accepting different texts for long periods. The criterion for inclusion was not historical fidelity. How could that be verified? But usefulness for the communities that used them and conformity with theological positions that were becoming dominant. Comparing the canonical Gospels with each other, the differences are striking. Mark has no story of Jesus' birth. Matthew and Luke do, but the stories are incompatible with each other. In Matthew, Joseph and Mary seem to originally live in Bethlehem and only later move to Nazareth. In Luke, they come from Nazareth to Bethlehem because of the census and then return. The genealogy of Jesus in Matthew differs from the genealogy in Luke. The resurrection accounts are especially contradictory. Who went to the tomb, what they found, who they saw, where they went afterward, practically no detail is consistent between the versions. Scholars have developed sophisticated tools to analyze these differences. The two-source hypothesis proposes that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a base, adding material from a second lost source called Q, in addition to their own unique traditions. This explains why sometimes agree with each other against Marcos, and why they sometimes completely diverge. The analysis of forms identifies narrative units that circulated independently before being incorporated into the Gospels, often preserving the form in which they were used in liturgical or preaching contexts. The redaction analysis examines how each evangelist edited their sources, revealing their specific theological concerns. What emerges from this analysis is not a reliable historical record, but a process of literary and theological elaboration that transformed a first-century Jewish apocalyptic preacher into a divine figure with characteristics and teachings shaped by the needs of communities that arose decades after his death. This does not mean that nothing in the Gospels is historical, but it means that separating history from theology is extremely difficult, and that naive trust in the texts as precise records is unjustifiable. The Vatican is aware of all this. The more serious Catholic scholars recognize the conclusions of modern biblical criticism. The Vatican itself has published documents admitting that the Gospels contain theological elements beyond historical information. But this information rarely reaches ordinary believers. In seminaries, priests learn about biblical criticism. In pulpits, they preach as if the Gospels were journalistic reports. The divide between what leaders know and what they allow followers to know is one of the most insidious forms of maintaining power through controlled information. In 325 of the Common Era, Emperor Constantine summoned bishops from across the Roman Empire to the city of Nicaea, in present-day Turkey, to resolve a dispute that threatened the unity of his empire. The issue was apparently theological. What was the exact nature of Jesus Christ? Was he equal to the Father, of the same substance, eternal like him? Or was he subordinate, created by the Father, divine but of inferior nature? It seems like an abstract discussion, but the practical implications were enormous, and the outcome of the council would shape Christianity forever. The central dispute pitted Arius, a presbyter from Alexandria, against Athanasius, his bishop. Arius argued that if Jesus was the Son of God, then logically there was a time when the Son did not exist, before being begotten by the Father. This made Jesus subordinate, not equal to God. Athanasius defended that the Father and the Son were of the same substance, co-equal and co-eternal. To modern ears, the difference seems subtle, but for the participants in the debate, it represented the difference between orthodoxy and heresy, between salvation and condemnation. What Spinoza would have noted, and what later scholars confirmed, is that the debate was not purely theological. Behind the disputes over substance and nature were issues of power and territory. Bishops from the major metropolitan sees competed for influence. Factions aligned themselves not only by theological conviction, but by political alliances. The emperor, although he probably did not understand or care about the theological subtleties, had an interest in a resolution that would pacify his subjects and unify the church under a doctrine he could control. The Nicene Creed that emerged from the council was, therefore, a political document as much as a theological one. It declared that Jesus was of the same substance as the Father, rejecting the Arian position. But the Greek word used, homoousios, was controversial. It did not appear in the scriptures. It had philosophical connotations that many bishops considered pagan. Some who signed the creed did so under imperial pressure, not out of conviction. The disputes would continue for decades, with Arian or semi-Arian positions prevailing at various times, until the Nicene position finally triumphed not through superior arguments, but by having the support of the right emperors at the right moments. The council also made other consequential decisions. It established the date of Easter, resolving a dispute that had divided communities for some time. It defined rules regarding ordination and ecclesiastical hierarchy. It began the process of standardization that would transform the diverse Christianity of the early centuries into a more uniform institution under centralized episcopal control. But perhaps most importantly was the precedent established. Questions about the nature of God and religious truth could be decided by voting in assemblies convened by political authorities. Divine truth did not descend from heaven in unequivocal revelation. It was established by men gathered in rooms, debating, negotiating, pressuring, voting. And once decided, it became mandatory for all Christians, with dissent punished as heresy. Subsequent councils continued the process. Constantinople in 381 expanded the Nicene Creed. Ephesus in 431 condemned Nestorius and defined Mary as Theotokos, Mother of God. Chalcedon in 451 established the formula of the two natures of Christ, divine and human, in one person. Each council resolved disputes and created new ones. Each decision reflected not only theological considerations, but the balance of power between ecclesiastical factions and secular authorities. Spinoza saw in these councils the definitive evidence that Christian dogmas were human constructions, not divine revelations. If God wanted humans to know the truth about his nature, he could have revealed it clearly. The fact that bishops needed to meet in councils to debate and decide on these issues proved that there was no divine clarity, only human confusion resolved by human means, voting, political pressure, occasionally violence. The sacred texts did not offer clear guidance on these issues because the authors of the texts did not have them in mind. Jesus in the Gospels never explicitly states his metaphysical nature in terms that would resolve the disputes of the 4th century. Paul's letters can be read in ways that support both Arian and Nicene positions. Early Christians had diverse beliefs about the relationship between Jesus and God, and all could claim biblical support. The decision of Nicaea was not a discovery of truth already present in the texts. It was an imposition of one interpretation over others equally plausible. Even more revealing is what happened to the losers. Arian writings were systematically destroyed. Arian bishops were deposed and exiled. Arian communities were persecuted. Arian Christianity, which for some time was predominant in various regions of the empire, was eventually eliminated, not by theological persuasion but by political suppression. Today we know Arianism mainly through the writings of its opponents, who obviously did not present it favorably. This pattern repeated itself in all subsequent theological disputes. Orthodoxy did not win because it was true. It became true because it won, and it won by the usual methods of human power: political alliances, economic pressure, military force when necessary. The history of the councils is the history of how men decided what God would be, not of how they discovered what God was. If the councils established orthodoxy, the Inquisition enforced it. For centuries, this institution dedicated itself to identifying, persecuting, and eliminating those who deviated from the official doctrine. Heretics, secret Jews, witches, blasphemers, sodomites, readers of forbidden books, all were potential targets of a machinery of terror that operated with papal blessing and often with the support of secular powers. Spinoza knew the Inquisition up close. His family had fled from Portugal to Holland precisely to escape persecution. Many of his relatives had been forced to convert to Christianity under threat of death, practicing Judaism in secret for generations. The Portuguese and Spanish Inquisition specialized in hunting these new Christians suspected of Judaizing, confiscating their properties and often burning them alive in public spectacles called autos da fe. The methods of the Inquisition were systematically cruel. The accused could be arrested based on anonymous denunciations, never confronting their accusers. Interrogation often included torture, legally authorized to extract confessions. The rack, the wheel, the strappado, water, refined instruments of suffering were routinely employed. Confessions obtained under torture were considered valid, although anyone subjected to these methods would confess to anything to make the pain stop. Penalties ranged from light penances for minor offenses to death by burning for serious or repeat cases. Even those who escaped the maximum penalty often faced prolonged imprisonment, confiscation of property, mandatory wearing of shameful garments, prohibition from exercising certain professions, and stigma that extended to their descendants for generations. The Inquisition not only punished individuals, it destroyed entire families, entire lineages. The most disturbing aspect was the bureaucracy of terror. The Inquisition kept meticulous records. Career officials dedicated their lives to identifying and prosecuting heretics. There were procedural manuals, guides for interrogators, standardized forms. The institution operated with the impersonal efficiency of any public office, except that its product was human suffering on an industrial scale. The Inquisition's archives, partially preserved, reveal not sadistic monsters, but bureaucrats fulfilling their functions, applying regulations, following established protocols. Spinoza understood that the Inquisition was not an aberration, but a logical consequence of the system he criticized. If divine truth was revealed and contained in sacred texts interpreted authoritatively by the Church, then error is not simply a different opinion. It is a crime against God. If eternal salvation depends on believing correctly, then eliminating heretics is an act of mercy, saving others from contamination. If ecclesiastical authority comes from God, then challenging it is challenging God himself. The tolerance that Spinoza advocated was incompatible with these premises. For him, beliefs were private matters that the state had no right to regulate. Each person should be free to think whatever they wanted about God, the soul, salvation. No institution, religious or secular, should have the power to punish people for their opinions. Freedom of thought was the foundation of all other freedoms. This position seems obvious today to many, but it was revolutionary in the 17th century. Even the Protestants who had broken away from Rome often established their own forms of religious control, persecuting Catholics, Anabaptists, and anyone who deviated from their own orthodoxy. The idea that the state should be neutral in religious matters, allowing citizens to believe what they wanted, was considered a recipe for social chaos. Spinoza argued the opposite. Religious persecution did not produce true conformity, only hypocrisy. Tortured people said what their torturers wanted to hear, but continued to think what they had always thought. Repression created resentment and underground resistance, not genuine loyalty. Societies that allowed freedom of conscience, he argued, were more stable and prosperous than those that tried to impose religious uniformity. Subsequent history confirmed this analysis. The Netherlands, where Spinoza lived, became prosperous precisely because it sheltered refugees from religious persecution throughout Europe. The United States, founded on principles of religious freedom, became a powerhouse. Countries that maintained religious persecution stagnated or declined. Tolerance was not weakness, it was strength. But the Church never truly apologized for the Inquisition. There were vague gestures of acknowledgement of errors during the papacy of John Paul II, but without specific accountability, without admission that the institution as such was wrong, only some of its members. The archives remain partially closed. The victims were never formally rehabilitated. The institution that tortured and killed in the name of God for centuries presents itself today as a defender of human dignity, as if its history could be conveniently forgotten. Spinoza was one of the victims of intolerance. Although he escaped the most violent forms, he lived under constant threat, writing carefully to avoid the most dangerous accusations, publishing anonymously, never completely secure. But he continued writing because he knew that the truth once thought could not be unthought, and he hoped that eventually the truth would prevail over force. Spinoza was one of the first thinkers to systematically analyze the psychological mechanisms by which religion controls its adherents. He realized that the physical threat of the Inquisition was merely the external manifestation of a much deeper control that operated within the minds of the faithful themselves. Religion did not need to burn heretics if it could ensure that people never became heretics in the first place. And it achieved this through sophisticated psychological engineering that began in childhood and lasted a lifetime. The first element was fear. Fear of hell, eternal punishment for sinners. Fear of death, the great unknown that religion promises to tame. Fear of social exclusion, ostracism by family and community. Fear of God himself, the omniscient being who knows every thought, every desire, every weakness. This multifaceted fear was cultivated from a very young age, when children learned about demons, damnation, sin. Before they had the capacity to critically evaluate what was taught to them, fear was already installed in their hearts. The second element was guilt. The doctrine of original sin ensured that everyone was born guilty, stained by a crime committed at the dawn of time. No one was innocent. Everyone needed forgiveness. And forgiveness only came through authorized channels: confession, penance, sacraments administered by priests. Thus a person was kept in a perpetual state of debt, always owing to God, always needing the Church to mediate the impossible payment. The third element was deferred reward. Earthly life was presented as a vale of tears, a temporary trial that had to be endured in the name of future glory. Present suffering did not matter. Eternity in paradise would compensate for everything. This promise discouraged revolts against earthly injustices. Why risk your eternal salvation for temporary improvements? Exploited peasants, oppressed serfs, exhausted workers were advised to accept their fate with humility because their rewards would come in heaven. Spinoza saw this structure as ingeniously oppressive. It turned the victims themselves into accomplices of their oppression. The serf who could revolt against his lord was restrained not by guards, but by his own beliefs. The woman who could question her subordination was silenced not by physical force, but by religious teachings about her inferior nature. The thinker who could challenge orthodoxy was paralyzed not by external threats, but by internalized fear of eternal damnation. The most perverse aspect was that the system perpetuated itself. Parents who were indoctrinated their children. Communities that internalized control exerted pressure on deviant individuals. Orthodoxy was maintained not primarily by external authorities, but by the spontaneous social conformity of people who genuinely believed they were doing good by keeping others in line. Control became invisible because it was everywhere. Spinoza proposed as an alternative an ethics based on reason and self-knowledge, not on fear and guilt. The wise person, he argued, acts well not to avoid punishment or gain reward, but because they understand that virtue is its own reward. True knowledge liberates from the bondage of passions, including the fear and hope that religion manipulates. Genuine happiness comes not from faith in supernatural promises, but from understanding the nature of things as they really are. This was a liberating message, but also a demanding one. Spinoza did not offer the easy comforts of popular religion. He did not promise that a heavenly Father was watching over you, that your prayers would be answered, that death was not the end. He offered instead only the dignity of facing reality without crutches, the freedom to think without fear, the serenity that comes from accepting the necessity of all things. Centuries later, psychology and neuroscience have confirmed many of Spinoza's intuitions. We know that fear is processed in primitive brain structures that can override rational thought. We know that beliefs formed in childhood are especially resistant to change. We know that the need for social belonging is one of the most powerful human motivations, and that the fear of exclusion can lead people to conform against their own judgment. The mechanisms that Spinoza identified are real and continue to operate. Modern religions have become more sophisticated in their application. The fire of hell is less emphasized in many denominations, replaced by more positive messages about love and community, but the fundamental structure remains. The dependence on authorities for the interpretation of truth, the guilt that demands atonement through approved channels, the promise of rewards and the threat of punishments that no one can independently verify, the control that operates from within, making the victims themselves guard their own prison. Liberating oneself from this control requires what Spinoza called adequate knowledge, clear understanding of how things really work, rather than how we are told they work. It requires courage to question what everyone around accepts without question. It requires a willingness to face reality, even when it is less comforting than illusion. It is not an easy path, but for Spinoza, it was the only path to true freedom. Spinoza understood that theological lies served very concrete purposes of material accumulation. The Church was not just a spiritual organization, it was one of the largest enterprises in history, and its profits depended directly on keeping the faithful in a state of dependence and fear. Following the trail of money revealed motivations that theological justifications obscured. Tithing was the most basic form of extraction. 10% of all production from all Christians flowed into ecclesiastical coffers. For peasants who could barely survive, this was an overwhelming burden. But refusing was to risk eternal salvation, and often also earthly punishments, since in many regions failure to pay tithes was a crime punishable by secular power in alliance with the Church. In addition to tithing, there were fees for all sacraments. Baptism, confirmation, marriage, last rites, every milestone in life required payment to the Church. The dead were especially lucrative. Masses for the soul could be ordered indefinitely, and wealthy families spent fortunes trying to reduce the time their loved ones spent in purgatory. This doctrine, by the way, was a medieval innovation without clear biblical basis, which did not prevent it from generating enormous revenues for centuries. Indulgences took the monetization of salvation to the extreme. The Church literally sold forgiveness of sins and reduction of post-mortem penalties. There were price lists, sales campaigns, commissioned agents. The scandal of indulgences was the immediate spark of the Protestant Reformation, when Luther protested against the blatant sale of salvation to finance the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. But even after the Reformation, even after the criticisms, the economy of faith continued. Protestant churches developed their own mechanisms of extraction. Today, televangelists raise millions promising financial blessings for those who contribute. Neo-Pentecostal denominations teach theology of prosperity, according to which God rewards with material wealth those who generously donate, to the Church, obviously. The methods have changed, but the logic remains. Fear and hope converted into cash flow. The Catholic Church has accumulated an incalculable fortune over the centuries. Lands donated by hopeful faithful, works of art collected or commissioned, sumptuous buildings in every major city in Europe, treasures in gold and jewels. The Vatican Bank, involved in repeated financial scandals, manages resources whose total amount is kept secret. The institution that preaches humility and poverty lives in luxury that would shame many kings. Spinoza saw in this wealth the material evidence of the real function of institutional religion. If the goal were genuinely the salvation of souls, why accumulate treasures on earth that the Gospels expressly condemned? If the message were truly one of material detachment, why the obsession with tithes and donations? If God were the central concern, why did the Church behave in every way like any other organization concerned with power and wealth? The answer was that theology was ideology, a system of beliefs that justified and perpetuated existing power relations. The priest who told the peasant to accept his fate and pay his tithe was not necessarily being cynical. He himself believed in what he preached, but the objective effect of his preaching was to keep the peasant submissive and flowing resources upward in the hierarchy. The sincere beliefs of the operators of the system did not change the function of the system. Today, churches continue to be huge businesses, often tax-exempt and with little transparency about their finances. Pastors live in mansions while preaching to congregations of the poor. Denominations accumulate billion-dollar real estate holdings while soliciting donations from retirees. The prosperity gospel promises that God will multiply what you give to the church, which thrives while the faithful wait for miracles that do not come. Spinoza would say that none of this is surprising. Where there is power, there is corruption. Where there is unquestioned belief, there is exploitation. The solution is not to reform religion by replacing corrupt leaders with honest ones, but to examine the very beliefs that make exploitation possible. As long as people believe that their eternal salvation depends on authorized intermediaries, they will be vulnerable to exploitation by those intermediaries. Genuine liberation requires the realization that there is no salvation to be bought, no original sin to atone for, no purgatory to shorten, and therefore nothing that priests can sell. Spinoza lived at the height of the scientific revolution, when thinkers like Galileo, Descartes, and Newton were radically transforming human understanding of the universe. He saw the Church fiercely resist these discoveries and understood that the conflict between science and religion was not accidental but structural. Institutional religion depended on a worldview that science was systematically demolishing. Galileo's case was exemplary. His crime was not simply asserting that the earth revolved around the sun. It was challenging the Church's authority to define the truth about the natural world. The geocentric cosmology was not just a scientific theory, it was embedded in Christian theology. The earth at the center of the universe, with the heavens revolving around it, reflected the centrality of the human drama of salvation. If the earth were just one planet among others orbiting a star among billions, what did that say about humanity's cosmic importance? The Church forced Galileo to recant, banned his works, and maintained for centuries the position that the literal interpretation of scriptures on cosmology should prevail over scientific observation. Only in 1992, 350 years later, was there a formal admission that Galileo had been treated unjustly, and even that admission was carefully qualified to protect the Church's authority. Spinoza saw that the problem was deeper than a dispute over astronomy. Science operated on fundamentally incompatible principles with religious authority. Science required verifiable evidence. Religion required faith in unverifiable revelations. Science was open to revision when new evidence emerged. Religion claimed to possess eternal and unchangeable truths. Science was inherently democratic, accessible to anyone who mastered its methods. Religion was inherently hierarchical, with authorities defining the correct interpretation. The conflict extended to all domains that science penetrated. Geology revealed that the Earth was billions of years old, not the thousands suggested by biblical chronology. Evolutionary biology showed that species were not created separately, but descended from common ancestors through natural processes. Archaeology failed to find evidence of biblical events that should have left massive traces, such as the exodus of millions of people through the desert. Neuroscience revealed that phenomena attributed to the soul, consciousness, personality, emotion, depended on physical brain structures. With each discovery, religion retreated, reinterpreting passages that had previously been read literally as metaphors or allegories. The process continued until almost nothing of the literal biblical narrative remained defensible to informed people. But this constant retreat was never honestly admitted. The Church continued to claim authority to pronounce on truths, even as its worldview was being demolished piece by scientific inquiry. Spinoza anticipated this dynamic. He argued that there was no genuine conflict between reason and religion properly understood, because properly understood, religion did not make factual claims about the natural world. The Bible was not a book of science, it was a collection of texts aimed at inspiring devotion and guiding moral behavior. Interpreting it as a source of knowledge about astronomy, geology, or biology was to commit a category error. But this elegant solution was unacceptable to institutional church because it removed the basis of its authority. If the Bible was not a source of factual truth, why should ecclesiastical interpretation be privileged? If knowledge about the world came from rational inquiry, not revelation, then scientists were more reliable authorities than bishops. The monopoly on truth that the Church claimed was dissolving. Today, the conflict continues in new forms. Creationists fight to infiltrate pseudoscience into schools. Anti-vaccine movements often have a religious basis. Climate change denial is strongest in conservative religious communities. Scientific authority is attacked by those who rightly perceive that it threatens faith-based worldviews. Spinoza would remind us that this conflict is not symmetrical. Science does not ask you to believe without evidence. It asks you to examine the evidence and come to your own conclusions. Religion asks for faith, trust in authorities, submission to traditions. These are fundamentally different modes of relation to truth, and pretending that they can coexist comfortably is to ignore centuries of conflict and the logical incompatibility of their principles. It would be comforting to think that the problems Spinoza identified belong to the past, that the modern church is a reformed institution, transparent, committed to truth. Unfortunately, the evidence points in the opposite direction. The 21st century Vatican continues to employ the same strategies of information control, institutional protection, and manipulation that its predecessors used for centuries. The scandal of sexual abuse by priests is perhaps the most grotesque example. For decades, the Vatican systematically covered up cases of clerical pedophilia. Accused priests were transferred to other parishes instead of being handed over to the authorities. Victims were pressured to silence themselves, sometimes with financial settlements accompanied by confidentiality clauses. Bishops who knew of abuses hid them from their congregations and civil authorities. The protection of institutional image consistently prevailed over the protection of children. Documents that have come to light revealed that this cover-up was systemic, not the work of a few corrupt individuals. There were policies, procedures, guidelines coming from the highest levels of the hierarchy. The then Cardinal Ratzinger, future Pope Benedict XVI, headed for years the congregation responsible for these cases, and under his supervision, the standard approach was secrecy and protection of the Church. Subsequent apologies, no matter how sincere, do not change the fact that the institution prioritized its own image over the lives of children. Spinoza would recognize this pattern. An institution that sees itself as the guardian of divine truth easily concludes that its preservation is more important than any worldly consideration. If the Church is the vehicle of eternal salvation, then protecting it from scandal is protecting the possibility of salvation for millions. Sacrificing a few victims for the greater institution may seem, in this distorted logic, a lesser evil. The theology that places the Church above all else inevitably generates an ethics that sacrifices individuals for the collective good defined by the institution. But the abuse scandals are merely the most shocking manifestation of a broader mentality. The Vatican continues to resist any form of significant financial transparency. It continues to keep secrets in its archives about controversial historical periods. It continues to pronounce on scientific issues as if its opinion had special weight. It continues to try to influence civil legislation in countries around the world, especially on issues of sexuality and reproduction. The Church also continues to promote narratives that historical criticism has long refuted. Saints are canonized based on miracles that would not withstand serious investigation. Relics are venerated despite abundant evidence of fraud. Marian apparitions are endorsed without any critical scrutiny. The people are kept in a state of medieval credulity that absurdly contrasts with the modern world around them. And the fundamental lie remains, the claim that the Catholic Church is the sole custodian of divine truth, that its hierarchy was established by Christ himself, that its dogmas are infallible, that outside of it there is no salvation. This extraordinary claim, which would require extraordinary evidence, is sustained only by tradition and circular authority. The Church is true because it says it is true, and you must believe because it says you must believe. Spinoza offers the only adequate response to this claim. Examine the evidence for yourself. Do not take the word of any authority on what you should believe. Use your reason to evaluate the claims presented to you. If the evidence supports a conclusion, accept it provisionally, remaining open to revision. If it does not support it, reject it, no matter how old or venerable the tradition defending it may be. This is Spinoza's most precious legacy, not a set of conclusions to be accepted dogmatically, but a method of free thought that each person can apply for themselves. Truth does not belong to institutions. It belongs to those who seek it honestly. And honest inquiry, as Spinoza demonstrated, inevitably leads away from the lies that powerful institutions have an interest in perpetuating. We have reached the end of this journey through the lies of the Vatican and the truths that Spinoza revealed. But for you who have followed along to this point, this is not really a conclusion. It is a beginning. The knowledge you have acquired carries responsibilities. It is no longer possible to pretend you do not know. The question now is, what will you do with what you have learned? Spinoza faced this same question in his own life. After realizing that the foundations of his religion were unsustainable, he could have simply kept his conclusions to himself, living outwardly as everyone expected while thinking differently in private. Many have done this before and after him. It was the safe path, the path that avoided conflict, loss, persecution. He chose differently. He chose to live according to his convictions, even knowing the price he would pay. He chose to write and publish his ideas, even knowing he would be attacked. He chose intellectual integrity over social comfort. And although his life was difficult in many ways, isolation, poverty, threats, premature death, he found something he considered more valuable than anything he sacrificed: genuine inner freedom. This freedom is not simply the absence of external constraints. It is a mental state, a way of relating to reality. The wise person of Spinoza understands the necessity of all things, including their own limitations. They do not revolt against reality wishing it were different. They accept it as it is and work within its limits. They are not driven by hopes of supernatural rewards or fears of eternal punishments. They act well because they understand that virtue is its own reward. This may seem like a cold philosophy, devoid of the emotional warmth of religion, but Spinoza would disagree. He called the proper understanding of reality the intellectual love of God, not a personal God who answers prayers, but the eternal order of the universe contemplated with reverence and admiration. There is a form of spirituality in Spinoza's naturalism, a capacity for wonder at existence that does not depend on supernatural beliefs. Einstein, who declared himself a follower of Spinoza's God, experienced this feeling when contemplating the mathematical laws of the universe. Scientists often report experiences of awe and humility in the face of the vastness and complexity of the cosmos. Artists find meaning in creating beauty. Philosophers find satisfaction in the pursuit of truth. Humanists find purpose in alleviating suffering and promoting human flourishing. None of these experiences require belief in personal gods, immortal souls, or afterlife paradises. What traditional religion offers, community, ritual, sense of purpose, comfort in the face of death, can be found through other means. Communities can form around shared values without the need for supernatural beliefs. Rituals can mark important life passages without invoking invisible entities. Purpose can be built through chosen commitments to causes, relationships, creations. And death can be faced with dignity and serenity through the acceptance of our natural condition as finite beings, part of a nature that will continue after our individual end. Spinoza did not promise that this life would be easy. Abandoning the comforting certainties of religion to navigate the uncertainties of an existence without transcendent guarantees requires courage. There are moments of loneliness, doubt, existential anguish. The human condition is difficult, and religions arose precisely to deal with that difficulty. Rejecting them means accepting the difficulty without the painkillers they offer. But Spinoza also promised something precious in return: authenticity. Living in accordance with the truth, even when painful, preserves an integrity that living in accordance with comforting lies can never provide. There is a qualitative difference between the peace that comes from illusion and the peace that comes from understanding. The former is fragile, dependent on never examining its premises. The latter is solid, because there is nothing more to discover that could shake it. Spinoza lived this peace amid circumstances that would have destroyed less solid individuals. Excommunicated, rejected by his community, threatened with death, living in poverty, dying young from illness, he maintained until the end a serenity that impressed all who knew him. It was not passive resignation, but active acceptance, based on the understanding that things could not be different from what they were. He had found what he called beatitude, the supreme happiness that philosophy can offer. This is the invitation Spinoza extends to you through the centuries. Not an invitation to accept his conclusions dogmatically, because that would be trading one dogmatism for another. An invitation to think for yourself, examine the evidence, come to your own conclusions. An invitation to value truth more than comfort, freedom more than security, integrity more than social acceptance. An invitation to live a fully human life without supernatural crutches, with all the difficulty and all the dignity that this implies. The Vatican lied. It continues to lie. It will continue to lie as long as it exists, because the lie is the foundation of its power. But you no longer need to believe. The chains that seemed invisible because you did not know they were chains are now exposed. You can choose to remain trapped if the comfort of the prison seems preferable to the uncertainty of freedom, or you can choose to step out, face the world as it truly is, build meaning from your own finite and precious existence. Spinoza made his choice nearly 400 years ago. The best thinkers since then have made the same choice. Humanity is slowly awakening from the illusions that have controlled it for millennia. You are part of this awakening. What you do with this freedom is entirely up to you, but remember, the truth once seen cannot be unseen. Welcome to the other side. This has been the story of Spinoza against the Vatican. The story of a man who dared to think when thinking was forbidden. The story of buried truths that refuse to remain buried. The story of an institution that built empires on lies and continues, to this day, trying to keep those lies alive. But it is also your story now. The knowledge you have acquired in these hours makes you part of a lineage of seekers that stretches across centuries. You are not alone. Millions before you have made this same journey, and millions after you will make it. The truth is stronger than any institution. And no secret archive, no prohibition, no excommunication can stop it forever. Spinoza died at peace because he knew he had fulfilled his mission. He lit a flame that has never gone out. This narrative is part of that flame, now passed into your hands. What you do with it is your choice, but if it illuminates even a little of the darkness in which so many still live, it will have been worth it. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for your courage to question. Thank you for preferring the uncomfortable truth to the comforting lie. The world needs more people like that. The world needs you.